The hull stretched longer than a football field. 512 feet of steel and ambition, displacing 15,000 tons, requiring a crew of 80 just to keep it running. This wasn't just the world's largest private yacht. This was something else entirely. A fortress, a statement, a monument to one man's journey from Soviet poverty to oligarch power, wrapped in Italian craftsmanship and shrouded in geopolitics. Dilbar. The name belonged to Alisher Usmanov's mother. The yacht belonged to him. $800 million. That's the number that gets thrown around, though the exact figure remains locked behind shell companies and Cayman Island registries. What's known is this. When it launched in 2016 from the Lürssen shipyard in Bremen, Germany, it redefined what a private vessel could be. Not just in size, but in capability. 2 helipads. A pool so large it required a support beam running the width of the ship. Accommodations for 24 guests and 80 crew. Engines powerful enough to push all that mass at 22 knots, and systems, both mechanical and electronic, that spoke to purposes beyond leisure. You've seen the photographs. Gleaming white superstructure, teak decks wide enough to land aircraft, the name in elegant script across the stern. What the photographs don't show is what this vessel represented. Not just wealth, though there was that. Not just power, though Usmanov had plenty. This was insurance, a mobile safe house, a platform that could be anywhere, answerable to no one, flying whatever flag served the moment's need. But insurance policies have a way of becoming liabilities. What happened to Dilbar after 2022 wasn't just a change in ownership or a fall from grace. It was a case study in how quickly empires, even floating ones, can be frozen in place, walk backward through time. Before the sanctions, before the seizure, before the world shifted, and oligarchs found their assets trapped, their movements monitored, their carefully constructed systems of wealth suddenly under siege. Go back to when Dilbar was still free to roam, still the crown jewel of a fortune built on steel and telecommunications and political proximity to Vladimir Putin. If you want to understand stories like these, the rise and fall of the world's most powerful yachts and the people who commissioned them, please like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments which vessel you'd like explored next. These investigations take time, research, verification. Your support makes them possible. Now let's go deeper. Alisher Usmanov was born in 1953 in Chust, Uzbekistan, then part of the Soviet Union. His father was a state prosecutor. His mother, Dilbar, raised him in circumstances that were comfortable by Soviet standards, which is to say they weren't starving. The details of his early life are well documented, though Usmanov himself has been careful about which details get emphasized. What's clear is that he was ambitious, educated, connected. The Soviet Union was a system built on connections. Who you knew, who knew you, what you could provide, what you could extract. Usmanov studied at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, a training ground for the Soviet elite. He moved into positions that brought him close to power, not the visible power of party leadership, but the deeper power of resource control. Then came 1980. Usmanov was convicted of fraud and theft of state property. He served 6 years in a Uzbek prison. The conviction was later overturned, declared politically motivated, expunged from official records. Usmanov has always maintained his innocence. What's documented is this. He emerged from prison at exactly the moment the Soviet system was beginning to crack. The late 1980s. Perestroika. Glasnost. The slow-motion collapse of a superpower. For men with connections and hunger and a willingness to navigate the chaos, it was opportunity on a scale the world had never seen. State assets were being privatized. Industries worth billions were being sold for millions. The rules were being written in real time by the people fastest to seize control. Usmanov saw what was coming, or perhaps he was told what was coming by people in positions to know. He started with plastics, manufacturing, small ventures that built capital and connections. Then he moved into steel. Metallo Invest became one of Russia's largest iron ore and steel producers. The timing was perfect. Russia needed steel. The world needed Russian resources. The money flowed, but steel wasn't the real prize. That came later through a series of investments that demonstrated either remarkable foresight or remarkable access to information. Facebook. Usmanov's investment firm DST Global bought stakes early before the 2012 IPO, when most people still thought social media was a fad. When Facebook went public, that stake was worth billions. Similar moves in other tech companies, Alibaba, Xiaomi, Airbnb. Each investment timed almost perfectly, and there was Arsenal Football Club. Usmanov bought a 30% stake, challenging for control against American billionaire Stan Kroenke. The battle lasted years. Usmanov eventually sold his shares in 2018 for approximately £600 million. The club was a plaything, yes, but it was also legitimacy. You don't own a major English football club if you're just another Russian oligarch. You're a businessman, an investor, someone who deserves access to Western markets and Western respect. By 2015, Alisher Usmanov's net worth was estimated at around $15 billion. He owned estates, art collections, a mansion in Surrey, England valued at £50 million, and he owned yachts, several in fact, but nothing that matched his vision of what a vessel should be. Nothing that said what he needed to say. Here's what needed saying: I am untouchable. I am beyond. I have risen from a prison cell in Soviet Uzbekistan to heights that would have been impossible anywhere else, in any other time. And this vessel, this floating palace that bears my mother's name, is proof. The commission went to Lürsen. If you're going to build the world's largest private yacht, you go to the Germans. The Lürsen family had been building ships since 1875. Their yard in Bremen had produced everything from torpedo boats to mega yachts. They understood engineering. They understood discretion. They understood that some clients wanted more than luxury. They wanted capability. The contract was signed sometime in 2012 or early 2013. The exact date is unclear, hidden behind the layers of privacy that surround transactions at this level. What's known is that Usmanov wanted something unprecedented, not just large, not just expensive. He wanted a vessel that could function as a mobile headquarters, something that could stay at sea for extended periods, something with systems that went beyond entertainment. The specifications were extraordinary: 512 feet in length, 15,600 metric tons displacement. That made it heavier than some naval frigates. The beam, the width, was 74 feet. The draft, how deep it sat in the water, was 16 feet. These weren't just numbers. They represented engineering challenges that pushed Lürsen's capabilities. The engines were diesel-electric, 2 massive diesels generating power that fed electric motors turning the propellers. This system was quieter than traditional direct-drive diesels, more efficient, more flexible. It allowed for complex power management that could redirect energy to different systems as needed. Maximum speed was 22.2 knots. Range was approximately 6,000 nautical miles. That meant Dilbar could cross the Atlantic or cruise the Mediterranean for weeks without refueling. But it was the internal systems that told the real story. The yacht required a 40,000 kilowatt diesel generator, the largest ever installed on a private vessel at the time. Why? Because of the pool. Not a small lap pool or a decorative splash pad. A pool that measured 82 feet long and 20 feet wide. A pool that held over 180 cubic meters of water, weighing nearly 200 tons when filled. A pool that required its own climate control, filtration, heating, and structural support systems. The support beam for that pool ran the entire width of the ship. It had to. The weight distribution was critical. Get it wrong, and the vessel could develop stability problems. Lurson's engineers spent months modeling the stresses, the loads, the way water would move when the ship heeled in rough seas. This wasn't about having the biggest pool because you could. Though there was that. This was about demonstrating that engineering limitations didn't apply. That if you had enough money and enough will, you could put an Olympic-sized pool on a boat. 2 helicopter landing pads, one on the bow, one on the upper deck aft. Both certified for aircraft up to a certain weight class. Helicopters meant independence. You could be anchored offshore and still move freely. Business meetings in Monaco. Dinners in Cannes. Back to the yacht before midnight. No customs. No records. No waiting. The guest accommodations were designed for 24 people across 12 staterooms, but this wasn't a hotel. Each space was custom designed, using materials sourced from around the world. Marble from Italy, woods from Africa and South America, fabrics commissioned from French and British mills. The master suite occupied an entire deck level, private terrace, private office, bedroom, bathroom, and sitting room that together covered more square footage than most people's homes. And the crew. 80 people. That's what it took to operate Dilbar, not to maintain it at dock, but to actually run it underway with guests aboard. Captain, first officer, engineers, deck crew, interior crew, chefs, stewards, laundry, maintenance, security. Think about that number, 80 people whose job was to serve 24 guests, a ratio of more than 3 crew members for every guest. The crew quarters were below, always below, out of sight, accessible through passages that guests never used. Small cabins shared in most cases. The captain and senior officers got single accommodations. Everyone else doubled up. 2 bunks, a small desk, shared bathrooms down the hall. Not bad by maritime standards. Better than a merchant vessel. But the contrast was stark. Above, master suites with private terraces. Below, crew quarters that could have been military. The hierarchy was rigid. Captain at the top, answerable only to Usmanov or his representatives. Below him, the department heads, chief engineer, chief officer, chief steward. Each controlled their domain absolutely. Cross a department head and your contract ended at the next port. Crew members were hired through agencies that specialized in yacht staff. Most were European. British officers were prized for their training and language skills. Filipinos and Indonesians filled many of the lower-tier positions. Galley staff, laundry, junior deckhands. The pay was good by their home country standards. Often they sent most of it back to families they saw once a year, if that. The contracts were strict. 6 months on, 2 months off, typically. But those 6 months were total commitment. 18-hour days weren't unusual. When the owner was aboard, you worked until the work was done. If that meant preparing a meal at 3 in the morning because guests wanted a snack after a night of drinking, you prepared the meal. If it meant scrubbing the deck at dawn because there'd been a party the night before, and the owner liked to take breakfast outside, you scrubbed the deck. And you smiled, always. That was in the contract, not literally but effectively. Discretion, professionalism, a pleasant demeanor at all times. No matter what you saw, no matter what you heard, no matter what you were asked to do within the scope of your duties, you maintained the fiction that this was all perfectly normal. That serving breakfast to people who spent more on a weekend than you'd earn in 5 years was just a job like any other. Lurson's construction timeline was aggressive. Even with their experience, building something this large and complex in 3 years was ambitious. The shipyard in Bremen became a fortress of secrecy. Workers signed NDAs. Photography was forbidden. Security monitored everyone who entered the facility. This was standard for yacht builds, but Dilbar took it further. There were systems being installed that weren't on any publicity materials. communications gear, satellite systems, things that didn't appear on the glossy brochures that yacht builders usually produced. The launch came in 2016, not a public event. No champagne-smashing ceremony with press photographers. The yacht was floated out quietly, moved to a private fitting-out dock, and completed away from curious eyes. The first sea trials were conducted with minimal fanfare. German maritime authorities inspected and certified the vessel. Everything was legal. Everything was proper. And then Dilbar left German waters and disappeared into the world of private yachting, where movements are tracked only by enthusiasts and those with reasons to care. The name Dilbar appeared on maritime registries. It flew under whatever flag was most convenient, which changed based on Usmanov's needs and the regulatory advantages different nations offered. At various times it was registered in Malta, in the Cayman Islands, through systems designed specifically to obscure true ownership while maintaining the legal fiction of compliance. The cost. Everyone wants to know the cost. The figure most commonly cited is $800 million. That includes construction, which was probably somewhere between $500 and $600 million. Then fitting out all the custom interiors, the art, the furnishings, the systems, then operational costs, crew salaries, maintenance, fuel, insurance, port fees, upgrades. Run a yacht like Dilbar and you're spending roughly 10% of its value per year just to keep it operational. $80 million annually, more in years when major refits or upgrades are required. Why? Why spend that much on a vessel that would spend most of its time sitting in port, depreciating, consuming resources? Because it wasn't really about the yacht. It was about what the yacht represented. Power has to be performed. Wealth has to be visible. And in the world Usmanov inhabited, where oligarchs competed for Putin's favor and positioning, where your value was determined by your demonstration of success, where falling behind meant losing access to the deals that created more wealth, you had to show strength. Dilbar was strength. It said, I can build this, I can operate this, I can maintain this, and by extension, I can be trusted with bigger things, larger investments, more sensitive operations. I have proven my capability at a level that few can match. The yacht's first years were spent moving between the Mediterranean playgrounds of the ultra-wealthy, Monaco during Grand Prix season, Sardinia in summer, the Caribbean in winter occasionally. Though Dilbar was really too large for many Caribbean ports, it required deep water, space, infrastructure that could handle its needs. When Dilbar arrived in a port, it was an event. Word would spread among the yacht community. The crews of smaller vessels, anything under 200 feet, would gather to stare. Captains would bring out binoculars. Photographers would rent boats to get close enough for shots they could sell to yacht magazines. The size was mesmerizing. You could know intellectually that it was 500 feet long, but until you saw it in person, saw it dwarfing everything around it, you couldn't quite process the scale. The parties aboard were legendary, not in the sense of wild excess, though there was certainly luxury, but legendary in terms of who attended. Russian officials, business leaders, politicians from various countries whose names never appeared on any guest list. These gatherings weren't just social events. They were business. Deals were discussed, alliances were formed, information was exchanged. The yacht provided perfect cover. You weren't meeting in an office building where security cameras recorded everyone who entered. You weren't in a hotel where staff might talk. You were at sea, on a private vessel, surrounded by water and crew who'd signed away their right to discuss anything they witnessed. The food was extraordinary. Usmanov employed multiple chefs, each specializing in different cuisines. Fresh ingredients were flown in, regardless of location. Russian caviar, Japanese fish, French cheeses, Italian wines from vintages that cost more per bottle than the crew members serving them earned in a month. The presentation was art. Each meal was theater, because that's what wealth at this level demanded. Not just good food, but proof that no expense, no effort, no complexity was beyond reach. The drinks were equally curated. Usmanov's collection included bottles that had never been commercially available, wines from private estates, spirits aged for decades, champagnes from years that sommeliers discussed in hushed tones. The wine cellar aboard Dilbar was climate-controlled, vibration-isolated, inventoried with the precision of a museum's holdings. And the pool. That massive, improbable pool that had required its own structural beam and enough engineering to float a smaller ship. It was heated to precise temperatures. The water was filtered continuously. At night, underwater lighting turned it into a glowing jewel. Guests would swim while the yacht was underway, feeling the gentle motion of the waves, surrounded by more luxury than most people would encounter in a lifetime. But luxury is performance. The guests saw the finished product. They didn't see the engine room crew changing filters in 100-degree heat. They didn't see the stewards laundering sheets at midnight because someone had spilled wine. They didn't see the chef screaming at a junior cook who'd improperly prepared a sauce, because in a kitchen where perfection was mandatory, mistakes meant termination. They didn't see the deck crew up at 5 in the morning, washing and polishing every surface, so it would be spotless when the first guest emerged for breakfast. The captain earned perhaps $300,000 a year. Excellent money. But he was on call every hour of every day. His phone was always within reach. His decisions affected the lives of everyone aboard. Screw up navigation and you could ground the ship. Mishandle a situation with guests and you'd be fired. Fail to manage the crew properly and you'd have a mutiny or, more likely, a steady stream of resignations that would make operations impossible. The engineers maintained systems that powered a small city. The electrical load alone required constant monitoring. The desalination system that converted seawater into fresh water. The waste treatment system that processed sewage from 80 crew and 24 guests. The HVAC system that climate-controlled hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of interior space. The navigation systems. The communication systems. The satellite feeds that kept Usmanov connected to his empire no matter where the yacht traveled. And the maintenance, endless maintenance. Teak decks needed to be scrubbed and oiled. Stainless steel needed polishing. Paint needed touching up. Mechanical systems needed inspection and service. It never stopped. The moment you finished one task, 3 more appeared. Because a yacht like Dilbar couldn't show wear, couldn't show age, had to remain perfect at all times, or it failed in its fundamental purpose. The crew developed their own culture. You had to. 6 months together in close quarters, isolated from shore, working impossible hours, you either built bonds or you broke. They drank together during rare shore leave, complained together in private spaces where no one could hear, formed relationships, some romantic, some simply born of shared hardship. The rules against crew fraternization were strict, but people are people. Late at night, when the guests were asleep and the officers were in their quarters, things happened. Connections formed. The ship became its own world with its own rules that existed beneath the official hierarchy. And they told stories about previous yachts, about worse owners, about the time someone dropped a crystal decanter worth $10,000 and the owner barely noticed, about the guest who got drunk and jumped off the side of the ship at 2 in the morning, requiring an emergency recovery operation, about the captain who had a breakdown and had to be airlifted off at the next port. The stories created mythology, made the work bearable, gave them something to hold on to when the hours stretched and the demands became absurd. Usmanov used Dilbar as it was intended, not primarily as a vacation retreat, though there were certainly leisure trips, but as an asset, a tool, a platform from which to conduct business with complete privacy and maximum impact. When you brought someone aboard, you were demonstrating your capability. You were showing them what you could build, what you could maintain, what you had access to. It was intimidation through hospitality, seduction through luxury. The yacht appeared at the right places during the right times. Monaco. Always Monaco, where the other oligarchs gathered, where being absent would have been noted. The Mediterranean coast during summer, moving between ports where the wealthy congregated. Occasionally venturing further to the Middle East, where different business required different conversations. And then the world shifted. February 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The response from Western nations was swift. Sanctions, asset freezes, travel bans, names appeared on lists. Oligarchs who'd spent decades building legitimacy, buying football clubs and estates and respectability, suddenly found themselves labeled, targeted. Their wealth, which they'd carefully distributed across jurisdictions and hidden behind corporate structures, became trapped. Alisher Usmanov was among the first named. The European Union sanctioned him on February 28, 2022. The United States followed. The United Kingdom added him to their list. The language was specific. He was described as someone who had particularly close ties to Vladimir Putin, someone who had promoted policies supporting the Russian government. The sanctions targeted his assets in Western jurisdictions, bank accounts frozen, properties seized, and yachts. Especially yachts. Dilbar was in Hamburg. This is the detail that would prove crucial. Not in Russian waters, not in a friendly jurisdiction. In Germany, at the Blom plus Voss shipyard, undergoing refit. The timing was catastrophic. Had the yacht been at sea, it might have fled to Russian waters. Had it been in a more neutral port, extraction might have been possible, but Hamburg was European Union territory, and the EU had just sanctioned Usmanov. German authorities moved quickly. On March 2, 2022, Dilbar was seized, not immediately confiscated, but frozen in place. The yacht wasn't allowed to leave. The refit work was stopped. The crew were allowed to remain aboard to maintain basic systems, but all operations ceased. The yacht sat, immobilized, while lawyers began the complex work of determining exactly what could be done under international law. Usmanov denied ownership. This is standard procedure. The yacht was registered through corporate structures, shell companies owned by other shell companies. The legal owner of record was Parvis Holding, a company registered in Malta. Parvis was owned by other entities. The chain extended through multiple jurisdictions specifically to make true ownership difficult to determine and impossible to prove without extensive investigation. But the Germans had been preparing. This wasn't an impulsive seizure. Intelligence services across Europe had been tracking oligarch assets for years, mapping the corporate structures, documenting the connections. When sanctions were announced, they knew exactly where to look and what to freeze. Dilbar's beneficial ownership, the actual control and use of the vessel, was traced to Usmanov. That was enough. The crew situation became complicated. 80 people whose livelihoods depended on the yacht were suddenly in limbo. Some were released from their contracts. Others were kept on minimal staff to maintain critical systems. You can't just abandon a vessel this size. The engines need to be run periodically. Batteries need charging, bilges need pumping. Mechanical systems need inspection to prevent corrosion and decay. A skeleton crew remained, but the work changed. No longer serving guests or preparing for departure, just maintaining, preserving, waiting. The maintenance costs didn't stop. Even frozen, Dilbar consumed money, port fees, crew salaries, power, basic upkeep. Estimates suggested around 60 million euros per year minimum, potentially more depending on what systems required service. German authorities were now responsible for these costs, drawing from frozen Russian assets where possible, But the legal complexities were enormous, and the yacht sat, visible from shore, a monument transformed into a prison. Tourists would take photographs, news crews would shoot footage for stories about sanctions and frozen assets. The yacht that had represented ultimate freedom, the ability to go anywhere, do anything, answer to no one, was now the most trapped vessel in Europe. Usmanov fought back through lawyers, denied the allegations, claimed he had no relationship to Putin beyond what was necessary for any Russian businessman, argued that the sanctions were politically motivated, filed challenges in European courts. The legal battle was complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and layers of ownership that would take years to fully unravel. Meanwhile, his other assets faced similar fates. Estates in Europe were frozen, bank accounts were inaccessible, investments in Western companies were locked. The fortune he'd built over decades, carefully distributed to protect against exactly this scenario, was now working against him. Each diversification, each layer of protection became another legal battle. The Russian government's response was predictable: condemnation of Western sanctions, claims that this was theft, pure and simple, promises of retaliation. But the practical reality was clear. Assets held in Western jurisdictions were vulnerable. The rules that had allowed oligarchs to move freely between East and West, to benefit from Russian proximity to power while enjoying Western stability and luxury, those rules had changed. Other oligarchs watched and learned. Some moved assets quickly, trying to stay ahead of expanding sanctions lists. Others, their yachts already in motion, fled to safe harbors: Turkey, Dubai, Maldives, places that wouldn't honor European or American sanctions. The yacht community watched Dilbar's imprisonment and understood the message: nowhere in the West was safe. The war continued, sanctions expanded, more names were added to lists, more assets were frozen. The initial hope, perhaps, that this would be temporary, that some negotiated settlement would restore the status quo, faded. This was permanent, or as permanent as geopolitics ever gets. The world had split in a way that wouldn't be easily repaired. Dilbar remained in Hamburg. Months became a year. The crew situation stabilized at minimal levels. The yacht was maintained but not operated. Inside, the luxury was preserved. The art on the walls, the furniture in the staterooms, the equipment in the engine room, all of it waiting for a future that might never come. Think about the absurdity. $800 million of engineering and craftsmanship designed to go anywhere, stuck in a German port. The pool that had required its own structural beam, empty or filled but unused. The helicopter pads, clear but idle. The master suite with its private terrace, unoccupied. All those systems, all that capability, frozen by lawyers and politicians and circumstances beyond anyone's immediate control. The crew who remained, those who'd stayed to maintain the vessel, lived in a strange limbo. They were still technically employed, still drawing salaries from frozen accounts through complex arrangements. But the work was different. No guests, no voyages, no parties, just maintenance. The same tasks repeated endlessly: checking systems, running engines, polishing brass, keeping the yacht ready for a departure that wasn't coming. They weren't supposed to talk to press, but occasionally, in bars near the port, after too many drinks, someone would open up about what it was like to work aboard before the seizure, about Usmanov the few times crew members had interacted with him directly, about the strange feeling of maintaining a palace for ghosts, about wondering if they'd ever work in this industry again, or if their association with a sanctioned yacht would follow them. The port itself became accustomed to Dilbar's presence. What had initially been newsworthy became background: another frozen yacht, another casualty of sanctions. The initial curiosity faded. People stopped taking photographs. It was just there, part of the landscape. a very expensive reminder that global politics could reach anywhere. German authorities faced questions about what to do long-term. Seizing an asset is one thing, maintaining it is another. Actually confiscating it, transferring ownership to the state. In a state, that required legal processes that could take years. Selling it would be complicated. Who would buy? Any purchaser would face the risk that sanctions might be reversed, that Usmanov might successfully challenge the seizure, that they'd end up in the middle of an international legal nightmare. The yacht's value was depreciating, not catastrophically, because yachts this unique don't follow normal market rules. But maintenance wasn't perfect, systems degraded, technology aged. The longer it sat, the more work would be required to make it operational again. And in the fast-moving world of mega-yacht design, where new vessels were constantly pushing boundaries, Dilbar was slowly becoming last generation's achievement. Usmanov himself largely vanished from public view. He couldn't travel to the West without risk of arrest. His business operations in Russia continued, but the empire that had spanned continents was now divided. The portions in Russia remained accessible. Everything else was locked away, its status uncertain, its future dependent on events beyond any individual's control. His investment in Arsenal, which he'd sold in 2018, proved prescient. Had he still held that stake when sanctions hit, it would have been frozen too. The timing looked like either extraordinary luck or advanced knowledge that tensions were escalating toward crisis. Either way, he'd extracted himself from one high-profile Western asset before it became liability. But Dilbar was different. You can't sell a yacht being refitted. You can't extract an asset that's literally bolted into a German dock. The yacht was trapped, and with it, a significant portion of Usmanov's visible wealth. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. This vessel, commissioned to demonstrate power and freedom, had become a monument to limitations. All that engineering, all that expense, all those systems designed for independence, and it was stuck, frozen not by mechanical failure, but by political reality. The ocean is patient, yes, but patience means nothing when you can't reach the water. Other oligarchs drew conclusions. Some decided that yachts were too visible, too vulnerable. Better to invest in assets that could be hidden, moved, protected through structures that were harder to trace. Others doubled down, building new vessels in friendly jurisdictions, operating in waters where Western authority didn't reach. The yacht arms race continued, but the rules had changed. Meanwhile, the crew who'd served aboard Dilbar moved on to other vessels, other owners. They carried stories about the pool, about the parties, about the moment when everything stopped, about maintaining a frozen palace. In the tight-knit world of yacht crew, these stories became part of the mythology, a cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how large the yacht, no matter how powerful the owner, the world could reach out and stop you. The war in Ukraine continued. Negotiations happened and failed. Sanctions remained in place, expanded in some cases. The prospect of Dilbar returning to Usmanov's control grew dimmer. Even if sanctions were eventually lifted, even if some settlement was reached, years would have passed. The yacht would need extensive work. New crew would need to be hired and trained. Systems would need updating. It wouldn't be the same vessel that had been seized. And perhaps that was fitting. Because the world it had been built for, that moment in the 2000s and 10s, when Russian oligarchs could move freely between Moscow and London, when wealth could bridge political divides, when proximity to Putin was an asset rather than a liability in the West, that world was gone. Dilbar had been designed for a reality that no longer existed. The yacht had been commissioned in 2013 when the future looked different. When Crimea hadn't been annexed, when sanctions were limited and largely symbolic. When the relationship between Russia and the West was tense, but functional. In that context, building the world's largest private yacht made sense. It was a bet on stability, on the continuation of circumstances that allowed movement and access. That bet failed. Not through any fault in the yacht's design or construction, Lürsen had delivered exactly what was commissioned. The engineering was sound, the systems worked. The yacht could have operated successfully for decades, but it was built for a world that collapsed before it could fulfill its purpose. Think about Usmanov's mother, Dilbar, the woman whose name graced the stern, born in the Soviet Union, raised her son in circumstances of relative privilege, lived to see him rise to incredible wealth and power. Did she ever see the yacht? Did she ever understand what it represented? The journey from Soviet Uzbekistan to an $800 million vessel was almost incomprehensible, the kind of trajectory that only made sense in the specific chaos of post-Soviet Russia. And now that yacht sat in Hamburg. The name still visible on the stern, Dilbar, a mother's name on a frozen monument to her son's rise, and the limitations of power. The crew who remained developed routines. Monday, check the engine room systems. Tuesday, inspect the deck fittings. Wednesday, test the generators. The work was necessary but repetitive. They were maintaining a vessel that wasn't going anywhere, keeping it ready for a departure that existed only in theory. Some found it meditative. Others found it soul-crushing. All of them wondered how long it would continue. Port authorities in Hamburg dealt with the practical realities. Dilbar wasn't their only frozen Russian asset, but it was the largest. It required coordination between multiple agencies: customs, Coast Guard, police, legal departments working through the bureaucracy of sanctions compliance, everyone doing their job, following procedures, while the yacht sat and waited. Proposals emerged periodically. Maybe the yacht could be seized and sold, with proceeds going to Ukrainian relief efforts. Maybe it could be converted to other uses: a floating hospital, a refugee accommodation center. These ideas circulated in media and political discussions but faced enormous legal obstacles. You can't just repurpose someone's property, even if that someone is sanctioned. International law is complex, precedents matter. Every action invited legal challenges that could drag through courts for years. So the yacht remained, preserved, maintained, frozen. A strange kind of limbo where nothing changed and everything had changed. The physical vessel was intact, but its purpose, its reason for existence was gone. Usmanov's fortune continued to exist, though its exact status was unclear. Russian assets remained under his control. Investments in Russian companies, holdings in metal production and telecommunications. These continued to generate wealth. But the western portion of his empire, the diversification he'd carefully built, was locked away. Forbes stopped reliably tracking his net worth. The opacity of Russian business combined with sanctions made accurate assessment impossible. Other oligarchs who'd faced similar sanctions found ways to adapt. Some worked through relatives or trusted associates who weren't sanctioned. Others pivoted entirely toward Russian and Asian markets, accepting that the West was closed.